It is being described within the shadow-draped corridors of the royal estate as an absolute seismic shift, a quiet, velvet-clad upheaval that has fundamentally shattered the internal hierarchy of the British monarchy. Behind closed doors, and away from the manicured lenses of the world press, the old order has crumbled in a single, devastating stroke. What was framed as a routine ceremonial duty for an aging king has instead turned into a high-stakes reckoning, stripping away decades of palace diplomacy to reveal a secret mandate buried in the vaults of history. An extraordinary power transfer has occurred, placing the ultimate moral authority of the crown into the hands of a single woman, while leaving the established machinery of the court in complete paralysis. The setting for this silent revolution was the heavy silence of St. James's Palace. King Charles entered carrying far more than the traditional parchment of state. Hidden beneath the velvet casing lay an unyielding covenant, a secret promise extracted decades earlier by the late Princess Diana in the agonizing final months of her life. The king had intentionally dismantled the traditional grandeur of the day. No triumphant fanfare, no lengthy speeches, and no elaborate military processions. The atmosphere was stripped down to a razor-sharp focus to ensure no institutional theater could distract from the gravity of what was about to unfold. Senior advisors and charity leaders stood in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing an event completely unprecedented in modern history. Catherine, Princess of Wales, felt the suffocating tension before her name was spoken. She had arrived expecting only to witness the monarch's closing act of public duty. But as Charles turned directly toward her, the hall plunged into chill. The king extended his hand, holding an ancient, heavily polished silver object that caught the dim chandelier light. Diana's personal royal seal. Beside Catherine, Prince William froze. His knuckles turned white as his eyes locked onto his late mother's distinctive script. A visible tremor passed through the future king as two eras of his life collided. The tragic grief of the mother he lost, and the weight resting on the wife at his side. In a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, the king declared the terms of the decree. Diana's silver seal, her private archive, and the exclusive mandate over her humanitarian vision were being transferred to Catherine alone. Seated apart from the table, Queen Consort Camilla remained frozen in rigid composure. Yet, as the king explicitly added that this transfer was absolute and could neither be amended, divided, nor shared, Camilla's expression tightened into a mask of suppressed fury. The sharp, non-verbal signals were undeniable. For years, the palace apparatus had sought to file Diana's memory away into quiet history. Now, with a single stroke of the pen, Charles had brought her ghost back into the center of power, crowning Catherine as the sole guardian of a legacy that bypassed Camilla entirely. As Catherine extended her hand, Charles placed the heavy seal directly into her palm, whispering, "This was always meant to reach you." But as she stood suspended between grief and duty, the king lifted the top parchment to reveal a hidden second page, a sealed document containing the precise reason why Diana had chosen Catherine long before she ever entered royal life. To understand the weight of that page, the palace was forced to confront the shadow hanging over the Princess of Wales title. To the public, it remained bound to Diana's raw vulnerability and unfinished crusade against cold protocol. For Catherine, accepting this authority meant risking the charge of usurping a martyr, while stepping back meant betraying the trust Diana designed to safeguard the crown's soul. For Charles, fulfilling this mandate was a long-belated attempt to settle a debt of conscience, publicly validating that Diana's instincts about the crown had been right all along. The moment the presentation concluded, William guided Catherine away from hovering courtiers into the sanctuary of the private library. Catherine set the silver seal onto a mahogany table, her fingers trembling as she confessed her dread of holding something so fiercely guarded. William took her hand, placing it back over the silver, assuring her that his mother would have trusted her implicitly. But as Charles entered, bearing the handwritten declaration, Camilla stepped into the doorway, ready to wage a bitter war over the past. The atmosphere inside the ancient stone walls of the royal residence curdled into a toxic stillness the moment the heavy oak doors of the king's library clicked shut. Behind gold leaf molding and silk-lined walls, a subterranean war was being waged for control over an institution built on secrecy. Outside, palace courtiers whispered in frantic huddles, sensing that the tectonic plates of the monarchy had shifted. Charles had executed a secret legal maneuver, bypassing the shadow network of senior advisors who had spent decades managing the crown's image. The king's decree was mercilessly precise. It stripped the old palace guard of their oversight and locked Diana's memory into an unassailable fortress, placing every record, seal, and initiative under Catherine's sole discretion. The institutional apparatus found itself completely neutralized by a dead princess's binding codicil. To trace the origins of this velvet coup, one had to look back to a rainy autumn evening at Kensington Palace decades earlier, an incident erased from official state logs, but preserved in a locked register. Diana had stood at a charity reception, watching as protocol officers callously ushered away a frightened 12-year-old girl who had stepped out of line to speak about her recently deceased mother. When a senior aide moved to clear the receiving line, Diana stopped him with a single, sharp gesture. She ignored the frantic signals of her private secretaries, stepped away from the velvet rope, and knelt directly on the cold floor beside the sobbing child. For 20 minutes, as the rigid schedule of the monarchy collapsed around her, Diana remained on her knees, listening to the child's grief. Later that evening, isolated in her private sitting room, Diana recorded a haunting testament. Her voice, preserved on analog tape, was devoid of anger, but filled with terrifying, prophetic clarity. She warned that an institution prioritizing timing, protocol, and appearance over human suffering was an institution quietly dying from within. Taking out her personal fountain pen, the gold and sapphire instrument reserved only for private family letters, she made a decisive alteration to her legacy declaration. With deliberate strokes, she crossed through the formal phrasing that would have passed her humanitarian mandate to the closest female relation of legal age. In its place, her handwriting cut across the cream parchment, to the woman who protects the human heart of the crown. For years, King Charles had kept that document sealed inside his private vault, waiting to see if such a woman would ever exist within the icy confines of the royal household. The answer arrived not during a state banquet, but during a routine, unpublicized visit to a pediatric hospital. Charles watched silently through an observation window as Catherine broke away from her security detail. Urged onward by nervous aides, anxious to meet the departure schedule, Catherine refused to move, choosing instead to sit in total privacy beside a grieving mother who had just lost her child. There were no cameras and no press advisors. In that unscripted moment of empathy, Charles recognized the exact clause Diana had written. The prerequisite had been fulfilled. The promise could no longer be delayed. This realization ignited an unprecedented explosion inside the king's study as Queen Consort Camilla confronted Charles without the buffer of press secretaries. The tension was suffocating. Camilla's voice trembled with wounded pride and calculated fury as she demanded to know why the memory of a long-deceased rival was being resurrected to diminish her standing as queen. She accused the king of committing an act of public humiliation, allowing Diana's posthumous hand to dictate the future of the household. But Charles remained motionless behind his desk, his face carved from stone. When Camilla bitterly demanded whether Diana still exerted final authority over their marriage, Charles met her gaze without flinching, delivering a sentence of devastating finality. Not in our marriage, in this promise. Before the raw humiliation of that statement could settle, the double doors swung open, and Prince William stepped across the threshold. He walked in not as a submissive heir, but with the cold, unyielding authority of the future king. Under his arm, he carried the finalized, legally binding royal trust document, executed by the highest legal authorities of the realm. The terms were absolute. Diana's seal, her personal correspondence, her private voice recordings, and millions in reserved charitable funds were now legally insulated inside a trust over which Catherine had sole, unalterable control. Neither the sovereign, nor any future consort, nor any council of senior palace officials possessed legal standing to modify a single line. The shadow reign of traditional court intrigue had been crushed, leaving Camilla isolated as Catherine's role as the moral anchor of the monarchy was carved permanently into history. The The tension inside the king's private library reached a razor-sharp pitch as the full legal reality of the trust settled into the suffocating room. Queen Consort Camilla looked between the signed parchment on the mahogany desk and her husband, her meticulously practiced composure finally shattering into open, desperate defiance. She demanded an immediate freeze on the transfer, insisting that the Privy Council be summoned to audit the document and that her office be granted co-stewardship over the archive. Her voice, usually carefully modulated for royal protocol, carried an uncharacteristic edge of panic. She argued that handing absolute control of Diana's legacy to Catherine was a deliberate attempt to destabilize her own standing within the household. But the response she received was not a compromise. It was an unyielding wall of absolute authority. Prince William stepped forward, his tall frame blocking the soft light from the tall library windows. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, the expression of a future sovereign who had drawn an indelible line in the sand. Without raising his voice, William issued a devastating ultimatum that silenced the room. The legal trust would be registered with the Crown Secretariat before nightfall without a single alteration, or he would personally address the senior advisors of the realm and lay bare the exact moral grounds of his mother's mandate. The implied threat was clear and insurmountable. Any public or private attempt to block Catherine would be met with an explicit, high-level exposure of the palace's long history of suppression. Camilla turned her burning gaze toward Catherine, seeking to provoke a retreat or an apology from the younger woman. She accused Catherine of quietly orchestrating a coup, taking advantage of an aging king's lingering guilt to elevate herself above the established hierarchy. But Catherine did not flinch, nor did she look away. The years of quiet observation and emotional suppression culminated in a moment of terrifying poise. Meeting Camilla's eyes with absolute calmness, Catherine delivered her terms in a low, measured voice that resonated with unquestionable finality. She stated that she had never sought the seal, nor had she requested the heavy burden it carried. However, since the king had commanded it, and Diana's unfulfilled wish demanded it, she would execute her duties without hesitation, without compromise, and without seeking permission from anyone in that room. The balance of power, cultivated over decades through quiet palace intrigue, dissolved in that single exchange. Then came the moment that permanently broke any lingering hope of resistance. King Charles reached into the drawer of his desk and retrieved a small, silver-bound audio playback device, the recorded key referenced in the trust register. The king pressed play, and the high ceilings of the library filled with a sound that froze the breath in every chest, the soft, lingering, unmistakable voice of Princess Diana. Recorded in total isolation decades earlier, her words cut through the room like a physical blade. She spoke not with bitterness, but with a terrifying, prophetic clarity, warning that a crown devoid of genuine compassion was merely an empty theatrical shell. She charged the future Princess of Wales with acting as an unshakable guardian over William's heart, demanding that she protect his humanity from the suffocating cynicism of court politics. As the recording ended, a heavy, sacred silence descended upon the library. Charles sat with his head bowed, tears glistening in his eyes, as decades of unspoken remorse found their ultimate, tragic resolution. Camilla stood utterly paralyzed, her face drained of color. The realization hit her with devastating weight. No amount of institutional power, no titles, and no royal decrees could ever dismantle a mandate delivered from beyond the grave. Justice had triumphed, but its victory was cold, heavy, and absolute. Outside the library, the shockwaves were already tearing through the palace administration. Sensing the immediate collapse of their influence, a senior courtier aligned with the old guard made a frantic, clandestine attempt to intervene. He attempted to divert a sealed wooden archive box containing Diana's private correspondence, directing a junior clerk to transport it to Clarence House before Catherine's team could secure the inventory. But the maneuver failed catastrophically in the long gallery. Princess Anne stepped directly out of the shadows, her presence halting the courtier in his tracks. Without uttering a word, the Princess Royal snatched the box from his trembling hands. Her cold, piercing glare delivered an unspoken verdict that terminated the advisor's palace career on the spot. Turning on her heel, Princess Anne carried the archive box directly into Catherine's private chambers, signaling to the entire household that the royal family had closed ranks around the new guardian. Back inside the library, the confrontation reached its quiet, devastating conclusion. Camilla, realizing that every legal, personal, and political avenue had been permanently closed, slowly removed her ceremonial gloves and placed them sharply onto the desk beside the unsigned document. It was a gesture of total, bitter surrender. Turning without a word, she exited the room, her footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. When she reached her private sitting room, she stood before her glass cabinet, her hand trembling as she stared at the empty velvet hook where the ceremonial archive key had hung for over a decade. The key was gone, the seal was transferred, and the balance of power had shifted forever. As the grey London dawn broke over the sharp spires of Kensington Palace, the royal household woke not to a victory celebration, but to the crushing weight of an irreversible reality. The administrative machinery that had governed the crown for generations had been irrevocably rewired overnight. Senior courtiers who had once dictated the public narrative now moved through the stone corridors in sullen, defeated silence, their influence stripped away by a single, legally binding decree. Reassigned offices, withdrawn invitations, and severed channels of access signaled the total purge of the traditional court network. In the private wing of Clarence House, Queen Consort Camilla sat amidst an uncharacteristic, suffocating stillness. The velvet-lined cabinets that had held decades of administrative authority now felt like empty relics. Her loss of power was not a temporary political setback. It was an absolute, fatalistic exile from the moral center of the court. She had learned the brutal, uncompromising law of palace dynamics. When the crown chooses to honor its dead, the living who stood against them are inexorably swept into the cold, unforgiving shadows of history. For Catherine, the morning brought no sense of personal triumph, only the suffocating gravity of a mandate carved from decades of grief. Holding the ancient silver seal in her hands, she stood at the threshold of a new era, acutely aware that she was inheriting a heavy burden shaped by a woman she had never known. The Princess of Wales title, once shadowed by tragic memory and unhealed wounds, had been recast into an unyielding shield. Rather than staging a grand, theatrical proclamation, Catherine chose a moment of profound, restrained simplicity. Emerging before the iron gates of Kensington Palace, without royal fanfare, state robes, or artificial spectacle, she met directly with families supported by the late princess's foundational charities. In her hands, she held Diana's silver seal, a silent testament to a promise finally kept across time. The gathered crowd fell into a hushed stillness as Catherine placed the artifact beside a handwritten card that bore a single, haunting inscription. Compassion must remain the heart of duty. The public response was instantaneous and overwhelming, striking the palace like an emotional thunderbolt that reverberated across the nation. Headlines declared that Diana's final wish had at last been honored, settling a decades-long moral argument in a single morning. Catherine's quiet dignity transformed a private institutional feud into a historic reckoning. By refusing to turn her predecessor's memory into a commercialized show or an instrument of political vengeance, she sealed her status as the unshakable anchor of the monarchy's future. For Camilla, watching the television broadcasts from behind pulled drapes, the true cruelty of the moment lay in its absolute grace. Catherine had publicly acknowledged the Queen Consort with dignified respect, stating that honoring one woman's legacy did not require the humiliation of another. That act of supreme restraint stripped Camilla of any ability to frame herself as a victim, sealing her total political neutralization. Later that afternoon, far from the glare of television cameras, and without a single advisor present to record the words, King Charles convened a final, solemn meeting in his private chambers. Gathered around a small wooden table, the core figures of the royal family faced one another in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Catherine placed the silver seal in the center of the mahogany, its polished surface reflecting the dim afternoon light. King Charles looked upon his son, his daughter-in-law, and his wife with the quiet resignation of a monarch who had finally surrendered his burden to history. He formally declared that his last great duty as sovereign was complete. The debt owed to Diana had been paid in full, and the constitutional continuity of the throne was permanently secured. William reached out, taking his father's hand in a moment of silent, profound reconciliation, releasing the bitterness that had poisoned their relationship for decades. With the silver seal resting securely in Catherine's hands, the dark cloud that had hovered over the royal house for 30 years finally began to lift, replaced by a quiet, fatalistic acceptance of what must be. Camilla accepted the strict limits of her place without further struggle, her shadow reign brought to a definitive, silent end. Charles, exhausted by the toll of his final duty, withdrew into the quiet sanctuary of his private duties, knowing that the moral authority of his house had been safely passed to the next generation. The institutional war was over, leaving behind a family bound not by enforced protocol, but by the weight of a shared, painful truth. In the end, the history of the British crown has always been written in the quiet shadows of sacrifice, where personal desire is inexorably crushed under the immense weight of dynastic survival. The silver seal now rests in Catherine's hands, not as an emblem of easy power, but as an eternal monument to a promise that survived 3 decades of silence, betrayal, and institutional denial. The throne moves forward, forever altered by the spectral hand of the princess who refused to be forgotten, proving that even the most formidable empire cannot withstand the enduring force of a protected truth. Thank you for watching. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep, unvarnished revelations behind